All right, AP World History, some bonus notes. Lucky you. All right, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to jump here into, well, we'll see how hard it is. I'm doing some dog sitting, so I'm gonna hope that we don't have too many dog interruptions. But want to be able to take you through a little bit here about uh, the Columbian Exchange, and then we're going to take a look at some forced labor systems, and maybe even get to some rise of some of these maritime empires, which you've already been kind of, I don't know, flirting around a little bit with already. So this would just be kind of taking it taking it elsewhere. So let me go ahead and start us off. There we go. Section 3, the Columbian Exchange. This is kind of one of those big kind of earth-shaking kind of phenomenon. Columbian Exchange will get a lot of reference in terms of impacts of Europeans making it over to the Americas, where we kind of left things off with the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Dutch, all of those in there, and particularly when we talk about some of the first Europeans arriving over here, so more like the Spanish, a little bit of the Portuguese, is where we see most of these impacts with what comes to be called the Columbian Exchange. Definition ish is going to be kind of this linkage between old world, and I'm going to mainly kind of focus that as Europe, and then a lot of these new parts of mainly Central South America that have been basically overtaken by mainly the Spanish, and a little bit with the Portuguese as well. And exchange just is going to mean just that. Columbian is just kind of coming from Columbus, his name. But exchange is just what are the things, kind of like the little picture you see there, okay? What things are coming from the new world to the old, and what things are coming from the old world to the new. These are going to impact both the new world and the old world. And there's no way that you can kind of study a bit about the Columbian Exchange and not understand how this is just revolutionary, ground, earth shaking, that sort of thing. Okay. First up, I'll talk about along with the exchange, and even with the video, the gun, germs, and steel video that we were watching in class, makes a point about this. And when they refer to these Europeans as these accidental conquerors, because unbeknownst to them, when they come over here to the Americas, they are carrying diseases that the Europeans have immunity to, but they're introducing it to indigenous and native American peoples who have never been exposed to these before. And so this is going to end up, and when we talk about this exchange, it's not all hey, you have some potatoes, and in exchange you can have some horses. It's not going to necessarily be that kind of a thing, because there's definitely kind of this dark side to it. Couple of the real biggies that are going to be killers that conquistadors and then other Europeans will unknowingly bring to the Americas with them are smallpox, which is kind of what you see the illustration over there on the right side, all the little dots all over those people. That is a potentially deadly disease that Europeans had been, it was still something that still happened in Europe in the 1500s. It wasn't like it was a disease that had been eradicated or an illness. But Europeans had been dealing with it for, by that point, really centuries, and so had built up a certain level of immunity. But the indigenous people here in the Americas, they've got nothing to fight against it, and it's believed that by the time smallpox does its thing in the Americas, that it kills about 50% of the indigenous, the native people, the populations, and in some regions, they historians postulate that percentage might have been as high as 90%. In specific areas. So there's no getting around that one of the biggest impacts is going to be that impact of disease. Strangely enough, on the flip side, there's not going to be much that the Europeans are going to take back home with them that they're going to obtain while they're in the Americas. It's not as if the indigenous native peoples over here have a bunch of illnesses that they are immune to, but that the Europeans are not. Usually, when we take a look at what kinds of health issues did Europeans go back to Europe with, a lot of times it was venereal disease. A lot of these guys who are coming over here, well, they come over as soldiers, they come over as adventurers. They don't bring the wife and the kids with them. Many of them, because they're soldiers or adventurers, don't have the wife and kids, and so they have relations with the native people over here, and sometimes that ends up with VD. Okay, and so they talk about syphilis as being an example of one that goes back to Europe from the Americas. All right. On a more positive side is the sharing of crops and animals. Now, this, I don't want you to think of this as like they were doing like this direct trade. I'll give you 3 potatoes for a horse. It's not that kind of a thing, okay? When we talk about the Columbian Exchange, it's just going to be the wholesale, the idea that, over in the Americas, Europeans are going to discover all of these animals and plants and things that they do not have in Europe, and they're just going to be like, this is amazing, and bringing this stuff back, and then likewise, there's going to be things that these Europeans bring over with them from Europe. That are being introduced for the first time over here in the Americas, okay? And so down here at the bottom, some of the biggies, especially when we're talking about the animals, horses and cows did not exist in the Americas, not domesticated cows. I mean, you might find bison and things like that, but cows, dairy cows, that kind of thing, they did not exist in the Americas. That the concept of the domesticated cow comes over with the explorers and the adventurers from Europe. Same with horses. And horses is for some Native American tribes. I mean, this is going to be a game changer. Some of them will adopt these horses being brought over, and it will completely change the entire culture of the way that some of these tribes operate, particularly up in North America. And we'll get into some of those, and then some examples of some of the different kinds of crops and plants and that kind of thing that are going back and forth. You're going to be working, probably already working on an assignment that's going to have you doing a little bit of a deep dive on your own into just the kind of the breadth and the depth of all of the different things that are being exchanged to this. I'm just really covering just a little bit of just kind of in a nutshell. As far as examples go, I'm not going to get real deep into it because you're going to get plenty more of those things. So the ones I was just talking to there were things that had come over to the Americas, and then going back over to Europe. You see a lot of things here that we just kind of take for granted. It's like maize, corn, potatoes, and cacao, which is more kind of getting into chocolate. Things we take for granted, but these were all new, being brought over to Europe in the 16th century. These were things they'd never seen before. And so, we'll see these adopted and adapted in all kinds of different ways. I mean, within about 100, 200 years, for example, potatoes are like a staple crop in places like Ireland and that kind of thing. And then some of these crops that make it over to Europe will also end up going beyond just Europe. Some of them will end up in Africa and other places like that as well. So it's not just completely limited to just goes to Europe. Anywhere else that Europeans are having some contacts with, whether it is through trade and that kind of thing, will also eventually be introduced to a lot of these things. All right, so that'll give you just in a nutshell. And it's a real condensed run, but the Columbian Exchange, like I said, you're going to be digging a little deeper on that on your own, both in our textbook, and then I have another assignment that you guys will be working on, which I think actually you'll probably be working on by the time you listen to this. They'll have you getting a little more close and personal. All right, forced labor systems. Take a look at that and the way that particularly these Europeans who are now, creating their empires, kind of spreading around and establishing their colonies, how they are going to go about, basically uh, forcing different groups of people into work. And probably one of the bigger ways of that is going to be dealt with, when a lot of these Europeans, particularly again Portuguese and Spanish, when they first come to the Americas, their original idea is that they are going to enslave the indigenous people there to work for them at farming some of these crops that are going to be in demand, working for them in mining, all kinds of different capacities, but that they were going to use the native peoples themselves. Okay, that plan starts to fizzle when smallpox, measles, other illnesses begin to take root in these native people, and they start dying off in large numbers. On top of that, a lot of the native people who decide that this whole working as your slave thing doesn't sound like my idea of fun, end up just running away. They know the land better than the Europeans, and so they can kind of vanish into the wilderness or whatever it may be, and the Europeans are without the labor. So that is what is going to eventually result in what comes to be known as the transatlantic slave trade. Okay. And with the transatlantic slave trade, that is where the focus is going to spin over. And remember, it's the Portuguese that had done a lot of that exploration of the west coast of Africa. And it's through that exploration that they become aware of the fact that there are some African tribes and kingdoms that fight against each other, and they enslave each other when they, as far as like prisoners in warfare and that sort of thing. And so the Portuguese are going to take advantage of that, capitalize on that by starting to purchase African slaves and moving them across the Atlantic Ocean, transatlantic, and then putting those slaves to work in America. They get over to the Americas. They don't know the land, and so you've got that part of it. And they seem to be a little bit more resilient. Especially by this time, some of them have had a little bit more contact with some Europeans, and so health-wise, they seem to be a little bit more resilient. Beyond that, there seems to be for the Europeans a virtual, almost endless supply, as long as they've got trade goods that they can trade along some of these western kind of what come to be known as slave forts in Africa along the western coast. As long as the Europeans have trade goods, they're going to have the ability to be able to trade for slaves to bring over to the Americas to work. Okay, diaspora. Some of you from AP Hug might recognize that word. It was one that we mentioned at points. When you see that word diaspora, think of a dispersion. Okay. And this is going to be that point in history where we start to see the dispersion of the African population being dispersed outside of the continent, with the bulk of them being brought over here to the Americas, whether it's down into some of the Spanish colonies in Southern America, some of the Portuguese colonies in present-day Brazil, and then some of those Spanish colonies that are being established in the Caribbean region already there. Whenever you have a people who, because of maybe race or religion, ethnicity, who are in a way forced to spread out, that's where that word diaspora comes in. Okay, sometimes we'll hear that term. We got a dog issue. Hold on, guys. About that, dog insurrection has been quelled. All right. Let's see. Number 2, kind of impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. This whole, again, kind of forced labor system that is now going to be put into use to do all the work in the new world will result in a lot of changes in terms of culture and languages, things like that. Creole is a combination of a lot of your African languages, sometimes melding in European languages. Those of you from the AP Hug world, you kind of remember our whole thing about languages, kind of starting with kind of pidgin languages for peoples of different languages to try to figure out a way of communicating with each other, and then that sometimes pidgin languages can then evolve into Creole languages. And so we see some of that that comes about as a result of the fact that a lot of people are being brought across the Atlantic who speak no Spanish, no Portuguese, and so languages are going to have to be figured out that way. And then likewise, we'll see changes when it comes to food and music. And a lot of that is going to be, as at first thousands and before it's all over, before millions of slaves are brought over from Africa, they are like most humans. They're going to adapt to this new world that they now find themselves in. And so where we see a lot of that adaptation is now mixing with Europeans who in effect, being there in that forced slavery system, basically own them. But in areas like food and music, we'll see that mixing again of African and European cultures. Okay. Let's see, environmental impacts, and again, this is just when we talk about the Columbian Exchange in the bigger scheme of things. There are going to be environmental impacts. We've got the human impacts. We've got just the trade impacts, more or less, and now some of that. The Europeans are going to be pretty aggressive, and of course, we're talking about the 16th century, and so people thinking about, I think people just had a very different view that any damage done to the planet will repair itself, and so people didn't really think too much in terms of minimizing the kind of destruction that went about with their need to create large farms and that sort of thing. And so the concept of deforestation, just, I mean, acres and acres of trees being brought down so that that the remaining land could be converted over into farming territory, that kind of thing becomes pretty common. And then soil depletion, even though Europeans by this time know about, basically using crop rotation and, that 3 or 4 field system, they don't really make use of it over here in the New World. I think the idea is it appears like there is such an endless amount of land that they just kind of forget a lot of what they know about, taking care of growing land and making it last. And so the result is, not too shocking. It's kind of why Europeans had to learn, those techniques in the first place, is you start to see a lot of soil depletion in different areas. And a lot of that is also just driven for the lust for profit. I mean, if you're trying to make as much profit, as much money as you can, then, why spare a quarter of your fields every year? When if you just deplete it, you're just going to move, another 20, 30 miles, and start up, cut down trees and start a new farm, that kind of a thinking, that kind of an idea. All right. I am kind of watching the clock here. And then demographic impacts. Kind of mentioned already. So we're going to have this, significant loss in native population in the Americas because of disease, and the little chart there just kind of focuses in on just Mexico as an example, and just shows that plummeting of population in the early to mid 1500s. Yeah. And then when we talk about demographic impacts, we can also look at the flip side of that. I mean, while we see a lot of population loss over in the Americas, 2 other places are going to see a bump. Europe definitely, and especially with the introduction of some of these new foods. These are going to be foods that are easy to grow. They adapt very easily to European growing conditions, and it's going to increase the food supply in Europe, which is going to result in a boom in some population in different areas of Europe. And so we do see a positive bump in Europe during this time frame as a result of the Columbian Exchange. Africa is kind of an interesting case, because in some areas of Africa, particularly Central Africa, where there may be more Africans that are being kind of swallowed up by the transatlantic slave trade, some parts of Africa are going to see some population loss because of the impacts of the slave trade. Other parts of Africa, though, they are going to see some of these new foods coming from the Americas end up in Africa as well. Yams is one that gets mentioned a lot, and well, not my favorite veggie out there, is one that really it grows very easily in the climate and soil conditions of a lot of parts of Africa. and is given some credit to actually seeing a population boom in some parts of Africa. So it's a little more mixed in Africa. It's a little more complicated in Africa because of the impact of the slave trade, but there's no getting around that there's demographic impacts in Africa as well as Europe. All right. Okay. I want to get started in on this section 4, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but at least get it introduced to you here. Okay. I'm at 20 minutes. I'm going to maybe go about like 5 minutes more. Okay. Try to keep this slightly under control. Okay. So we are dealing with a time frame here where we're going to see this massive expansion going on, political expansion, religious, economic rivalries. This is really where we start turning that corner into all these empires that are forming up and beginning to view each other as as rivals, whether it is on a political, economic, or religious kind of a basis. We've already talked about Portugal and and again, this idea of a trading post empire, that they're not going to go out and establish colonies, kind of like we talked about with the French and the British and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese. Well, the Portuguese, they do establish one colony, in the Americas, but everywhere else, they're pretty much kind of going with this idea of the trading post empire that we've already talked about. Okay, and in Africa, I'm going to pop this up here. In Africa itself, the Portuguese will use military power, their own military power, to try to. I don't know if we really want to go as far as saying, trying to create an empire in Africa. That might be pushing a little bit too far, but they definitely want to maintain their influence over trade on the west coast of Africa, and that access to slaves. And so when we talk about the Asante Empire and then the Kingdom of the Congo, these are a couple of African entities that form up, and the Portuguese let them form up. They do not push back against these guys. They don't fight against them. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that both of these are empires and kingdoms that are very active on the trade front, and not only trading, some of the basically native goods coming out of Africa, but also the slave trade. Both Asante and Congo participate in the slave trade. They go to war against other kingdoms in Africa, and again, the prisoners that they take become slaves that they then trade for European goods to the Portuguese. Okay, and so that's where you're kind of getting a little bit of that seagoing linkage between Portugal and Africa. All right, and then I think we're just going to do this slide, and that'll be a good place to call it. All right. Real quick, and again, I think we've mentioned this even somewhat back in Unit 3, but when we look at Asia, both Japan and China are kind of beginning to kind of isolate themselves, not acting as active on the world trade front, and so just a lot of that going on. Let's see, for C, the bigger these empires grow, whoever we're talking about, it hopefully kind of makes only common sense that as they get bigger, their labor demands are going to keep growing. All right. And so we're going to see Europeans, and when I say Europeans now, I'm talking about pretty much all of them. The British especially will take advantage of the indentured servitude system and try to use this as their solution to their needs for more labor in their little American colonies that they have going on, whether it's Jamestown and areas like that. The idea with indentured servitude is pretty simple. Usually it's someone from maybe probably back over in England who wants to get out of the country, a little adventure, whatever it might be, and so they sign on to come over to America. They're going to work for someone for 5 to 7 years, and at the end of that, they will be granted basically their freedom, and they can kind of get their life going. And so that brings a lot of people over. A lot of people do take advantage of that and come over here and are working for trade companies and that kind of thing. But after 5 to 7 years, they're free. So it's it's kind of a temporary, meets the temporary needs of those demands, but not what is going to be the final answer that they're looking for. And that's where we get into what comes to be known as chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is what I think most of us traditionally think of slavery. And that is that, you are a slave for life. Your children who are born to you will be born into slavery. They will never know freedom. And then their children, same thing. Okay. And increasingly, chattel slavery will be the form of slavery that will be used here in the Americas. Okay. And that's North, Central, South, the Caribbean, all through there. All right, let's see. Also, we talked about these empires growing. Is that we also see these rivalries really starting to pick up. By the time we're getting into the 16, 1700s, trade posts, we have three countries who are establishing trading posts in India. Remember, the Portuguese are in there first, but the British and French are now starting to become more aggressive in their empire building. And so pretty soon you'll have three European countries, and they are competing. This is not polite. It's not a warfare, but still, they are doing everything they can to try to gain an edge over the other countries that are also trading. What we will eventually see is the British are going to over time they're going to overshadow both the Portuguese and the French. A big part of that is going to be the establishment of a trade company, the British East India Company, and this is an example of what is called a joint stock company. And a joint stock company, pretty simple. Investors put money into a company. They're doing this on the hope that this company is going to be able to conduct successful and profitable trade that will then pay dividends to its stockholders. That is how the company gets the money to operate, to buy ships, to establish trading posts, is they get it from their investors. And then when everything works out beautifully the way that it should, and it will for the British East India Company for a long time, the people who put their money into the company end up making dividends. They make profits personally from the success of the company. All right. And so, you think about our stock market today and buying stocks from companies that trade. This is the idea of it. You invest, you buy stocks, you basically are giving them money that they can then use to run their business and hopefully to grow their business. And when they make big profits, you do too as a stockholder. This is what the British are using. And this is what is going to allow them to eventually, by the time we get into the early 1800s, eventually pretty much have a stranglehold on India and turn it into what will eventually become their jewel crown colony in their empire. All right, but I'm getting ahead of myself there. All right, last thing we'll talk about here is what we have going on in the Americas, and that is a whole lot of competition going on. You'll have the Portuguese and the Spanish. They will eventually divide territory. The Treaty of I'm trying to remember how to pronounce this. Tordesillas in 1494. They kind of split the world between them. In their minds. And this was what results in the Portuguese getting most of present-day Brazil and the Spanish getting claim over pretty much everything else in the Americas, okay, until the British and the French and the Dutch show up. But as more Europeans do show up, you're going to have the British and the French are going to be competing over trying to gain Native American allies, the Iroquois Nation, a lot of these other big Native American groups up in North America. You'll have the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701 that where the French are able to establish a treaty with a number of these Native American tribes that will support the French. You have both sides vying to create alliances with Native Americans. As I mentioned in class before, the French can be far more successful at this than the British will be, just mainly because the French, their relationship is based around trade, where the British relationship a lot of times is based around land ownership. And that creates far more tension and conflict with the natives than what the French have. All right. That's already 5 minutes more than I figured it would go. I'll blame it on the dog interruption. But that'll cover us for now. I'll pick us up and get us the rest of this section taken care of in class on Wednesday. All right? All right. Hope you got some stuff. Hope you learned some stuff. See you next time.